done a very good job with your foliar diseases. Could you share what you did with your fungicide sprays this past year? Is there any big secret or?
No secret. Probably went in 3 times. Every other row. We would put on Christine.
Yeah, we did alternate the chemicals.
And you went in.
My neighbor, so
you went in a
what he
full
does,
bloom.
I do.
You went full bloom, petal fall, or what time? What were your timings?
Well, depending on the weather, of course, you know, then too. But yeah, we went full bloom. Well, first, you know, we did the dormant spray, of course.
And what did you with dormant? What was in dormant?
We used no, we didn't use Dormant. Just oil and what was that expensive?
Dimmoline?
Yeah. Yeah, Dimmoline. And
You remember how much it cost?
yeah, I do remember that. Yeah, after we got the bill, yeah, we both found that out.
Yeah.
And then at bloom, did you just spray once?
No, we went 3 times? 3 times this year?
Yeah, we probably went 3 times.
Okay, and then.
If I'd have known, I had all that wrote down.
Well, that's all right. And then did you go after bloom anytime?
Well, we quit when the rain stopped.
Yeah, I think we quit when the rain stopped.
So yeah, you went after bloom
Yeah, we went after
quite a
bloom,
few
yeah.
times. Yeah, I was commenting on that because a lot of people probably have lost their orchards. Probably don't have this many leaves on, and either to rust or to scab. This year, it's been one of those years with all the late spring rains and the lower temperature and increased orchard humidities that we've been seeing. A lot of defoliation has occurred, you know, across these orchards, and that's why I was bringing it up, because there's a lot of leaves still on these trees, and I don't think this is a picture we see in everybody's orchards. Now, I thought to kind of start off with, we're just going to focus on what we need to do in the dormant season. You know, typically, if we're coming in this year, we had a lot of rust across the area, and a lot of people went through and they're asking about dropping the leaves, so they're applying zinc sulfate to drop the leaves. It's getting a little late to do that. We just don't have the warm temperatures to really break down the leaves, so I don't know if it's even worth making that application to drop the leaves at this point of the year. I would probably push that to the last week of October, first week of November. And the reason it is, again, to get the leaves on the ground, so then you have a little bit more of the warm temperatures and also the moisture that the soil community will start breaking down that material. The reason why, the flip side of that is when you drop those leaves and you make that high dose of zinc sulfate, you're not able to actually move anything into the tree. So a lot of people think, and I've been guilty of this as well, that by making that application, you move a lot of zinc in. And actually what happens is you actually form that abscission layer forms so rapidly with that high dose of a salt, with zinc sulfate, that nothing else moves into the tree. So then you're just made with what gets onto the wood, which is roughly about 3% of the surface area of the tree. So that's why foliar sprays work, but when you make that same application onto the wood, you don't get as much in because you have only 3% of the 100% available. The leaf surface area makes up about 97% of the total surface area of the tree. So that gives you an idea of, you know, why foliar sprays make sense when there's leaves on the tree and why they're not as effective when they're not. So going into that, so rust we really can't do much about, but the good thing about rust is I think it's the one I rather live with. So if I had to pick one disease, even though they all cause defoliation, rust is the one I think I could tolerate. The one I worry about a lot, and where we can actually modify some of our dormant practices with, is scab. And scab is a little bit of more of a threatening disease in my book, because it's a relative of Alternaria, and as a lot of us have seen down in Kern County, is we know Alternaria can form resistance, so scab also can form resistance. I mean, not saying all fungi can, excuse me, a little word twist on that, but these two we know within the environment, when we apply persistent products over and over again, we can't see resistance. So typically when we're looking into an orchard, when we're trying to find and see if we have scab, other than defoliation due to scab, that's kind of a given in an orchard. But if we're trying to see what type of populations, we're going to be looking on the green tissue. This is what you're going to really look to identify scab within an orchard. And you're going to find these little brown circular lesions that are on the tissue. And this is what we're going to use here. these lesions are what we're essentially using to kind of monitor and check how much scab that we have in. Now, the thing to keep in mind is usually one side of the branch is green and one side's brown. You know, usually this is the top, the thing that was exposed to the sun. But you still will see these round lesions even coming through this brown tissue on top. Now, why that's important is, one, it gives you an idea that you have scab, but again, most people know. But the second thing is that's what you're targeting in the dormant season. So if you had a variety that lost its leaves to scab this year, and it doesn't seem, no matter what you do, you still lose those leaves for the past 2 years, I would go in probably a copper and oil spray. And this is what you're targeting. You're targeting those lesions. That copper and oil spray does two things. One, it burns back the lesion. And then the second thing is it actually delays the sporulation of the lesions that occur to where it pushes it later, with the idea of getting it out of those spring rains. So you're trying to get the lesion to sporulate outside of the spring rains, and actually falls better into those timings we recommend. Now, the funny thing is, I know some of you probably heard us, if you probably came one of these 10 years ago, they were telling you not to spray during dormant. And the truth is, you don't always have to spray during dormant. But when you're trying to deal with copper. When you're trying to deal with a population of a persistent fungus that's surviving on the tissue, you have to try to kill it. And that's essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to kill off this pathogen on the wood. So copper and oil is probably the one bet we have on the books that does a good job. We're trying to get the registration changed with Bravo, with chlorothalonil. Chlorothalonil does a nice job of killing back these lesions as well. But I'll tell you, if you spray chlorothalonil when you have any green tissue showing, you're setting yourself up for some problems. So if that registration does change, we can put that on and delay dormant. That would be another thing I would consider as another option to copper and oil spray. Jim Adescavich suggests you make that Bravo with oil, but it always makes me a little weary when you're spraying chlorothalonil and oil. You can get some burn, and he likes to put everything with oil. So I think Bravo with the surfactant weather stick will probably be just okay on its own. So that's probably the first step I would do if I had a scab problem. And you could target varieties. You can say, okay, I only really have it on my Carmel because Carmel is a susceptible variety if you need to save money. But I really think just starting in with a nice broad multi-mode of action fungicide with the copper oil will help reduce overwintering disease pressures across the orchard. Now, so that's one dormant practice I would keep in mind. And the other kind of foliar pathogen that kind of pops up this time of year, outside of bloom time diseases, and it's what this time of year meant late summer, would be alternaria. And again, alternaria is like rust. It survives only on the leaf tissue. It doesn't really necessarily survive on the wood, and it can, but it's so ubiquitous. It's found everywhere within the environment that there's not really any reason to try to go through and specifically target trying to kill alternaria in overwintering wood. And you're going to say, well, why is that? Well, it's because it's in the graves, it's in the landscape, it's in the trees, it's in the weeds. It's a very broad pathogen. It can live anywhere. So with both rust and alternaria, the goal should be we just need to protect the leaves from infection, and that's in season. So really, if you have a scab problem, this is where the dormant practice will kind of come into play. Now, kind of if you're thinking, well, what should I do differently because I lost all the leaves on my tree this year? I get this question a lot. With scab and rust, a lot of people try to put those two timings together. But if you lost leaves this year, pretty severe defoliations, one of those two fungi, I would plan to make an extra spray next year. Doesn't have to be any expensive material, but it should be something that you should be thinking about. Scab targets between 2 weeks and 5 weeks post-petal fall. So I like going a little earlier, like 2 to 3 weeks, not trying to split the difference and go 5 weeks. Most people say, well, I'm going to go 5 weeks because on that chart that UCIPM says 2 to 5 weeks for scab and 5 weeks on for rust. So if I go 5 weeks, I target them both. Well, you usually miss both. You actually get one or you get the other, but you have a problem. You don't get both. So target the one you have the issue with and make a spray for that. If it's rust, I'd probably still make that two week spray. and I would work to try to clean up the orchards this year, especially if you had a building rust population for the past 2 years, and look to make an extra spray in that early May period. And you can use anything from as cheap as micronized sulfur, which can flare some issues, which I'm sure Walt will probably talk about, can flare mites, as well as general broad spectrums, cat-tan, strobilurin, DMI. You have a whole broad spectrum of fungicides to use for rust. So it really comes down to which card you play for bloom. So keep that in mind of rotating through. I always like to see, and I guess the challenge to you growers is trying to work into a multi-mode action fungicide. So like a chlorothalonil or like a cat-tan, somewhere along the way to kind of break up the pattern of a DMI or strobilurin use. Because that seems like what we're seeing a lot of people doing these days, is going between bumper or tilt, then going back to a gem, abound, or pristine, then going back to a bumper or tilt, then gem, abound, or pristine. I'll tell you what, we lose those two chemistries, we're going to be up a world of hurt. That's just the simple fact of it. And if you don't think we are, we're already mixing the top two strobilurin with the top shelf DMI in a product called Quadris Top. So if you're wondering why Quadris Top works so well, it's because it's the two best fungicides we have on the market.
David, will you see the symptoms in May?
The symptoms? Okay, so with rust, not really.
Okay, that's an important thing because I think a lot of folks wait to see the symptoms.
Yeah. So a lot of that's a good question, Walt. Thanks for keeping me on target here.
Been around a while.
Yeah. So that 2 to 5 weeks post, let's talk about symptoms for targeting spray. The 2 to 5 weeks post petal fall for scab. That target, if you really want to hit this thing when it's going, if you walk out on an orchard and you find these lesions, and there will be a nice little black ring around the gray lesion, that's when this lesion's sporulating. You make a spray within 2 to 5 days of seeing that in the orchard, you're really going to knock down the population of scab. And all these sprays, that 2 to 5 weeks post petal fall, you will not see a symptom on the leaf until about 6 weeks, 6 to 10 weeks post petal fall. And all of a sudden, if you say, well, now I'm going to make a spray, well, it doesn't really do you much because it's already in the leaf, and you already have the spores on the leaf that already infected the tissue. It's now in the leaf. So you can't cure the leaf. You can only protect it with fungicides. So that's the reason why you have to spray before you see the symptoms. Now the same thing is with rust. If you say, well, I'm going to spray once I see rust, and it's kind of a prune mentality with prune rust, they'll wait till they see it before they make the first spray. You can kind of hold it, but you're not gonna really get it, and if conditions persist, you'll end up losing your leaves in the long run. So you have to make those sprays with the expectation of having disease, even though you're not seeing disease at the time. I think if you've had defoliation on any part of your orchard to those diseases, you guys, we need to make a spray and clean these orchards up. Because if we let's say we get into a nice dry run for the next 3 years, some of us hope not, but for foliar diseases, we don't have any spring rains, that's a good thing. We would still have a persistent population in these orchards unless we do an active attempt to clean these orchards up. So if we can get the orchard through the season looking like this, essentially, we can probably back off those sprays if we're coming into a dry year. So like in this case, where you guys are at, if we walk in next year and we don't really have a dry year, I would say you do what you did this year and you'll probably be okay. You might even be able to reduce it a spray. But if your orchard does not have any leaves because it dropped them all, you should include a spray even if we do have a dry spring. So I hate being a nozzle head and say spray, but it would be important to really try to do an effective job of cleaning these orchards up to allow us to reduce the applications in the long run. So that's kind of all I really had to say. I guess I'll open for questions. Yes, sir.
So if you put a fungicide in like a whole split spray targeting, say, rust, you're saying that's too late?
Yeah. So a fungicide at hull split maybe will help reduce some of your hull rot issues. But again, that comes down to coverage because you have to kind of get it inside that hull. But it's not going to do anything for rust or scab. The latest you're really going to get effective rust control is probably the first week of June. And I will say with rust in itself, rust is a completely different thing than scab. So if we think of it just at looking at rust, and we said, okay, what can I use fungicides for rust? The best one we can use is strobilurin. Now why? Because the mutation that would take for rust to become resistant to strobilurin, scientists say, so we say, that if that would occur, it would kill the rust spore. It's in a pathway that's required for living. But I always say nature finds a way, so again, rotation is key, but it's a very strong, effective fungicide that we can make in May or June that will target rust. Now, if we're making that with other fungi in the environment, we can increase our chance of resistance, so that's why you have to look more than just one pathogen. But yeah, early May, first week of May, first week of June, you put some type of control in for rust, you'd probably have a really clean orchard. That was a long-winded answer, I know.
Is there any harm in doing the oil copper sprays on a regular basis?
And within the orchard, like dormant period or in season, there is the ability for copper accumulation, which is it is a worry in some orchards, but with a single spray a year, I would probably say it'd be pretty minimal. And you know, when you see these copper accumulation to a toxic effect, they're putting on copper and Bordeaux mixtures where they're making several sprays within the year, and we're making a single spray, you know, once a year. So yes, there is the risk, but I really think with the ability for it to reduce the fungicide use down the road, it's probably it's worth it in my mind.
So were you talking about a harvest spray rather than a dormant spray?
That's a good question. So the copper oil spray should be made in dormant, and actually we prefer to say delayed dormant, but really what that means is bud swell. So when you start seeing the buds fattening up, that's when we want to make, that's what we call delayed dormant. It's about 2 weeks before bloom, and it's right before you start seeing the green on the tip. So that's when we may want to make that copper and oil spray. Now if you have Sonora in your orchard, it's going to be a little tougher to time that, because you're probably going to get a little bit of burn on those trees, because you know, whenever Sonora always, it's a weird variety, it greens up a little early sometimes. So you know, make sure you kind of keep that in mind as what varieties you have within your orchard.
That's a good time for the Demelin too, because a little twig borer are beginning to feed a little more at that time. So I think if you were targeting twig borer at that point, it'd be perfect. This is something we're going to be talking overlapping pests, but this dormant issue, I think you can also combine some things. So I'll be discussing it too, but remember what David said about this timing of the dormant spray.
We all on this block here is also copper and oil along with them.
Yes.
Do you see any difference between like a heavier oil versus lighter oil, or?
Not an effective control. I think the oil is kind of acting as a surfactant for the copper, and
It will for scale.
and I'm sure Walt will be able to add that in. But going back to, he said he made a copper and oil spray. I will tell you, it took me 20 minutes to find scab lesions on trees, and this is probably the longest I had to look for scab lesions in any orchard I've been in this year. So I think there's something to be said about making an application if you had a scab problem with copper and oil. So keep that thought in your mind as for the coming year.
What about young trees like second leaf?
So if you're kind of looking at non-bearing trees, so first you plant this year going to second leaf or going to third leaf, and you don't know if they're going to be harvested. A lot of times what you tend to see is people forego fungicides because they say, well, I don't have a crop on them, and I'm not going to make any money, so why really spend too hard of a time controlling the pathogens? Well, that's true, but you will build a population. You can build a population. The nice thing about young trees is why scab is not so much of a problem, and this is different than rust, so looking at scab, is you have enough circulation that you get a lot of drying in the orchard. So that actually reduces the amount of scab, and that kind of flips it over to why we're probably seeing a more increased incidence of these is because we're denser plantings, tighter row spacings, tighter tree spacings, and things like that. So in young orchards, scab's not a problem, but rust is. So you tend to see rust pop up in young orchards, and most growers kind of let it go. And if you say, okay, I'm just gonna let it go, and I'll take care of it in that third year, just I would say try to make a spray to clean it up. You know, keep that in mind, saying, okay, I'm going to my third year, I'm going to harvest this year, I'm going to put in, you know, something to control rust 5 weeks post petal fall, especially if we have a wet spring. Now, if it's nice, dry, beautiful, hot weather, you might get away with it in a young orchard, but I really think with the inoculum loads we're coming in with 2 years of really hard, high disease pressure, we're still going to have a carryover effect, even if the conditions are not conducive to any foliar disease. So that's kind of the way I look at it. You got to kind of wait to see what you're going to get. But if it was like last year, I'd make a spray. If it was like 3 years ago when it was completely bone dry, I would probably look at something cheap for just the young trees, like sulfur or something, just to kind of, you know, help with kind of suppress that population with the new orchard. No, that's a lot of that's kind of an I don't know question, but or answer, but it's kind of one of those things you got to wait and kind of see what we're going to do.
When they're small, you don't need that much spray anyway.
Yeah. You know, I have to say, rust, sulfur does a really nice job. So, but it's a protectant. So you got to have it on the leaf surface before the spore lands on the leaf. All these fungicides serve as protectants. So if you think that you can spray once you have disease, you're wasting your money. It may make you feel better, and it may make you sleep better at night, which may make it worth the money, but I don't want to give you any nightmares, but it's not doing you any good. So that's kind of the way to think about it. Any other questions? What are you smiling at, Walt?
Just pleased.
I don't know about that, but any other thoughts on diseases this past year? You guys have a lot of hall rot, I imagine. No hall rot? Yeah, hall rot is, I think it had to do, the past 2 years, I don't know if you guys kind of just follow the ambient humidity. The past 2 years, we've been about 20% higher